Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
That's a man's world out there, and it is. It's a dangerous place. Very dangerous. I've come across backpacks and shoes in the bush shredded and made me wonder if somebody met their end there. So you just don't play around. You just don't play around with nature and the type of animals you got out there. To me, it's like exploration going on to another planet. One of the things that amazes me when we're out in the bush is that you can look forever, you can travel all day long, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, going in the most remote places you can imagine, perfect times, feeding grounds even, where you know there's plenty of berries and food, salmon, and we don't even see a bear, a black bear. And there's hundreds of black bears in this general area. We don't even see a deer. It's just unbelievable. At night, you can set up on Lake Harrison here where we're at now. You can go 20 miles up there and look up towards Mount Breckenridge, and you won't see a flashlight, a car light, nothing. There are places, it's so thick and remote, you could hide a dinosaur up there and no one would never know it. Well, mine goes back to 1980 to a fishing trip I went on to northern Minnesota with a friend of mine. We got hung up in a feeder stream late one night, and about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, I think it was, the fishing had died down, real still and quiet, and I started hearing a pounding sound. The best way I could ever describe it to people is it's like tapping your chest with your fist and getting that dead thumping sound. But it was getting louder, gradual, real slow and gradually louder. And then I started hearing a breathing sound going in and out, like this. And it kept a perfect rhythm. The pounding kept a perfect rhythm. And I'm thinking, this must be the world's largest bear or something big is headed our way. I hope it doesn't come out of the night and we're sitting here in a few feet of water in a bass boat with only fishing poles to defend ourselves. Well, this thing just kept coming like it was coming right towards us. Now I'm 20, 22 years old, not afraid of anything in them days. Wouldn't want to admit to anybody that I was, and I was scared to death. I started getting really nervous. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. This pounding's getting louder, just like this, and the breathing's getting louder. And all I can tell you is something large on 2 feet ran by us on the shoreline, never broke its stride, never stopped its breathing pace, just like a machine. I don't think it ever knew we was there. And it just came right by from left to right for that brief moment, and you look at it like, what the hell was that? And then it just starts going away, and you start hearing everything in reverse that you heard coming towards you. It sounded like a jogger running. I should have known that. I was thinking four-legged animal, but it wasn't a galloping sound. It was just like 2 feet pounding the ground. When you're up in the bush and you come across a set of tracks so far removed from any of the nearest roads, you didn't even know you were going to be at that spot at that given moment. Who on earth put those tracks there? How did they get there, and why are they there? You can't just turn away from that and just scoff and say, somebody's playing a joke. If you're going to play a joke, you're going to go down by a park where you know people see something. You're not going to go way up in the bush. I've seen instances where I pushed a bush back to step down off of a log fall, and there was a track right there where the animal obviously had stepped where the bush was and moved it out of the way as it passed through, and the bush covered it back over and protected the track. Now, nobody set that hoping I'd see that someday. That's ludicrous. If we take a fake foot, like your shoe, you walk through this snow with your shoes on, every print you make is going to be a duplicate of the last, because you're walking with a solid, inanimate object. But when you're talking about a real working foot, there are signs you can look for.
Bucklets, boots.
We know from the old days, Green, all these guys that documented these things, people's tracks are offset. When you see your tracks in the snow or in the sand, left, right, they're just a little bit offset, usually pointed outward. A Sasquatch walks almost pigeon-toed, but he walks like he's walking a tightrope almost. Every track is almost the same in a straight line in front of the other one. Another thing we look for is it a fake track? When you see a line of tracks and you see toe movement between the tracks, you no longer have a fake foot, or else somebody's able to carry a bunch of fake feet with them and somehow put it on between strides without putting a foot down. That makes no sense at all. Her little daughter had seen it. She was with her on the road when it crossed in front of them, and she calls it the big monkey. So it's not a matter of whether or not she saw nothing. She saw something, and the little girl, small as she is, knows what a monkey is, and in her mind, that's what she saw. Something that looked like a monkey. And the lady on top of everything else, even though she talked to Tom, she doesn't want her name out there. These aren't people looking for publicity. These are people that just want to tell what they saw because they think it's that important. Roger Patterson wrote one time, "To the adventurer doesn't stop at the foothills but penetrates deep into the forest." To me, if you're going to look into anything, you should look into it thoroughly and not just half do it. It's like an adventure. It's a mystery. It's something that's come to me that I've had a taste of, and because of that, I can't let it go. Roger Patterson stated that he regretted that they'd not shot the animal, and he never wanted to do that. I believe that's a rare animal. But he took a lot of ridicule, him and Bob Gimlin, and it frustrates me, but I understand that scientists do need concrete evidence. I don't think you even necessarily have to kill the animal. I think if you can just get DNA of some sort, whether it be hair or whatever, then you've got a step in the right direction. At least they have to acknowledge there's an unknown primate running around. Well, in the mid-1930s, a jawbone was found in a cave in China. And an anthropologist looked at that and he says, this is a jawbone of an ape, a gorilla, but very large. And because of the way the jaw was spread, he said it also sets on a spine, meaning it walked upright. It wasn't a quadruped. They estimated that it probably would have been around 8 to 10 feet tall. They had teeth, had some of the teeth still in the lower jawbone. They found teeth over in China in the shops. They were grinding them up, these fossilized teeth, using them for medicine. Very interesting, because our continent was connected with China at one time. That was the only one at the time. Since then, 4 more jawbones have been found between Vietnam, India, and China. So these things were spread out over a long distance. And the first one, I think they dated back 500,000 years. Must have went extinct 500,000 years ago. The next one was like 300,000 and 200,000 and down to 100,000. Every time they find a newer one, okay, it went extinct then. John Green once said, you should, of all the things people describe, they have an amazing similarity in their description of what they're seeing, what they could make up and what they're seeing. And they describe this upright, large, bipedal ape. So now we don't have to make up a creature to fit it. We had one that we thought was extinct. Hair samples have been found, they've been turned in, they call them an unclassified primate. They don't really have anything to match them to. Well, about a year or so ago, DNA has finally gotten to the point they've been able to extract DNA from a fossil. Now, because we have hair samples that have been called unknown primates, there's no classification to put them to, I am hoping they will be able to get some of these teeth, because now over 4,000 teeth since the early finding of the first jawbone have been collected. And I'm hoping that one of them will be early enough to our time that they'll be able to get DNA from it. If they do, and they could match that to the hair samples of this unknown primate, then science will tell us exactly what a Sasquatch was. They didn't go extinct. This is what people have been saying for years. On the A&E Bigfoot special, they mentioned that not even 1,000 years ago, when the first Norsemen landed on the East Coast, they were writing about these hair-covered creatures that would come out at night, because they called it doing their work mostly at night. Were stealing salmon from the net. You could always tell when they're around. They had to smell. They're describing a Sasquatch. And the natives along the shoreline, who can't even speak their English their language at the same time, in their folklore, they're writing about the same creature. I find that interesting that not 1,000 years ago, two civilizations in the same area are talking about something that could very well fit the Sasquatch, this hairy, upright, man-like creature. And I find that very compelling.
So you believe it's a creature that hasn't actually gone extinct, coexisting with humanity throughout our history, probably even older than humanity?
Yeah, that's right, because so many descriptions where people have seen them in their headlights, even police officers in their spotlights have claimed to have seen them at night on patrols. They claim they have this eye glow, this eye shine. I asked the late Grover Krantz, anthropologist from Washington. I asked the current anthropologist from Idaho State University, Jeff Meldrum, has man ever had nocturnal capabilities? Would they have eye shine? And they said there's nothing in the record to substantiate that that ever happened. I put on a monkey suit, my eyes are still human. They don't glow. The Sasquatch, the light hits its eyes, they glow like a coyote, like a bear. You're talking about the Roger Patterson film of 1967. Documentaries talk about that film all the time, but they terribly misstate the evidence as it happened. They were down there for nearly 3 weeks, as it's been told, and they hadn't found any prints, and one morning, Bob and Roger went up into Bluff Creek where they'd been before. They've been all over the place. They had to say, where are we going to go today? They decided to go up into Bluff Creek, and that's when they rounded that bend up in Bluff Creek on the sandbar. There was a downfall tree. The tree had a root system that was standing there, probably 8, 9 feet high, as Bob describes it. Roger was just ahead of him on his horse. Bob's pulling a pack horse, and he's on his horse, but he's got a much bigger horse. Roger rode a little horse I always tease and say is the size of a Great Dane. Roger was a little guy. So anyway, Roger rounds the bend, and when he does, his horse goes crazy. And Roger notices off by the creek, there's a creature squatted there, covered with hair. He pulls his horse down, tries to control it. He gets off of it, gets his foot hung up in the stirrup, frees himself, and he had his camera in the saddlebag in case they saw tracks. He grabs the camera, it's one of those old hand-wound cameras, and he takes off running for it and tells Bob to cover him. The creature by then, when Bob come around and had seen it, when all this was going on with Roger's horse, it was standing. What had happened, Roger Patterson had an interest in the Sasquatch for about 7 years or so or more. He'd been out looking for evidence, looking for tracks, gathering reports. And then in the summer of 1967, on Onion Mountain, there were some tracks that had been found. They were building roads at that time up through, making a highway north, up through Bluff Creek and on in up the west coast. So John Green went down to see these tracks. John Green's a local man, lived here. And when he got there, the tracks had pretty much been backbladed and there was only a few left. Well, by the next morning, when John got up very early in the morning, the phone rang. And John says, obviously on a radio phone, the guy called and says, what you're looking for is here. That's all he said. John got a hold of the Sun newspaper in Vancouver. They put up $500 to get it paid for a plane and a pilot to fly him down. John got a hold of Dale Moffat, and he brought a tracking dog named White Lady. They all loaded on this small Cessna, and a guy by the name of Keith Shazari was the pilot. Keith I spoke to about a year ago, after all these years, you should have heard him. He says that it was amazing the way the dog, they put him on the scent of the track where they would still see him just before dark. He said, Bill, he says the hair literally stood up on its back. That dog went into high alert. There was something about those tracks it did not like. There was over 1,000 tracks had been reported there. They counted, I think, 560, 70 tracks that were still left. That other people had been there to see them. Some had run over them, had stepped on them. But these tracks went on for over a mile or so. It went off the road into the bush, up and down a few inclines, through bushwhacking, back out onto the road again. And there were actually 2 sets of tracks that I've seen in the pictures, 15 and 13 inch. They didn't know if they were together, but they did cross paths a few times going back and forth. And then at some point, John Green, who knew Roger Patterson, a lot of the guys knew each other in this little circle. He called Roger Patterson's house when he was in town, and he told him, he left a message with Mrs. Patterson, Patricia, that when you let Roger know there are tracks down here, because at that time Roger's away over at Mount St. Helens with Bob Gimlin on an expedition. There's tracks down here. We know he's wanting to shoot a little amateur documentary of him with a Sasquatch hunter. He was hoping to see some tracks to film. Tell him good tracks, pristine, nice looking tracks. Come on down. It took about 2 or 3 weeks before Gimlin got around to actually being able to leave. Him and Roger took off for Bluff Creek. By the time they got down there, Bob's told me that when we got down there, you could see where the tracks had been, a lot of them, but he says because of the rains and they were in dust and dirt, loose dirt, it kind of washed them out and took a lot of the definition out. You could tell they were footprints, but they weren't really the nice pristine tracks like John Green had described. A few years ago, we always got people claiming to be involved in this film as a hoax. And it's so disappointing that the news media is willing to welcome somebody claiming a hoax without investigation, without question. And this is what happened when Ray Wallace died. Ray Wallace had a construction company down in Bluff Creek many years ago, and then by the time the Patterson film was shot, he'd moved his operation back to Washington. But yet, every time footprints show up, they wanted to blame old Ray had a pair of wooden carvings here. You got Dan Rather with CBS, you got Fox News, you got MSNBC going on. The mystery of Bigfoot has been solved. It was Ray Wallace, according to the Ray Wallace family. Oh, wow. So let's take a look at that. They didn't. So what I did is I got Ray Wallace's carving, and I took, despite the fact that many of these were different lengths than the carving, different widths than the carving, I made them all the same length, I made them all the same width, and I can tell you, a 5-year-old, a beginner, if you'd have just made the comparison, you could see that this wood carving in its toe line could not have made that. But yet, these news channels, Ray never tried to fool anybody, yet skeptics, when you see the tracks along the road, they left this flat appearance, flat, flat, flat. Well, where's the recesses? This is in fine dust and dirt. It left flat tracks. Where Green and everybody stepped with their logging boots, their regular shoes, their tennis shoes, you can see the imprint of every sole pattern. This here would have left like a sponge print in that fine dirt. It would not have left a flat, which a pad does when you step all that weight down on it. It would not have been flat. And all of a sudden now they got to think, oh gosh, we were so certain that Ray Wallace made these. The transfer of evidence from this pattern on the bottom of this foot, which they call a stomper, could not have made this track. And these are the beginning, these are the Cibachrome images, they call them. They're the best images of the film itself. Here you can see the toes on the bottom of the animal. It's in motion. This foot's a little blurred. And here's at the end of the stride, this is one of the things I always point out to people. Notice how the foot is vertical to the ground. Look down here, the foot is hardly off the ground, it's already vertical to the ground. When people walk, and I explain this to folks that come out, even the skeptics, I tell them, listen, when people walk, their feet barely come 15 degrees off the ground. It's like a pendulum. They don't lift their feet vertical, high and vertical. I said, if you want to try doing it, it's hard enough to stand that way. But if you try walking that way, and as far as I know, no one has ever been able to duplicate that. Our bone structure just does not allow it. A biomechanical foot, and there's anthropology studies in scientific journals that talk about this. When the foot is in motion, it flexes. There are things that take place, and these toes, for instance, when you go to bend your foot, a Sasquatch has what we call a mid-tarsal break. Ankles back here, and right in front of it is actually where it bends its foot. You can see it in the film, you see it in the footprints. The ball of the foot was deeper, and of course the toes are always deeper because by then all of the weight of the animal has come forward. This part's lifted off the ground, and you got everything, and your toes work like hydraulics. You got muscles and tendons pressing down, and now you've got 800,000 pounds instead of being scattered over the whole foot. You got it on the front of the foot, then you got it on the toes last, and they sink in the deepest of the whole track. Here's a picture of 2005 where me and the watchman at 20 Mile Bay made it up to the top of a mountain that had a growed over switchback on it. And I walked over, and this track was there. Again, the big heel didn't even press here, the ball and the bulbous toes. It even reached a certain depth of dampness because this had water in it, and the air dries it out, but farther down you deep, you get into the moisture. This is my footprint. After I'd filmed it, I'm a pretty big guy, I took my foot for scale and put it right alongside of it. I have pointed heels, people do. Our heels are much narrower than the big rounded heel of a Sasquatch. Many years later, I'm talking to John Green, and he allows me to see some of his pictures from Blue Creek Mountain taken in the summer of 1967. This is the tracks, the 15 and 13-inch track where they crossed each other's paths at one point, and by golly, the heel stepped, the foot cupped, looked like it rolled over onto the ball, and the toes imprinted into the ground right here. And that is exactly what happened in 2005, because I was always bothered why it didn't press the middle. I've seen the mid-tarsal breaks, like you see in the Patterson film, where the foot bends and the large part of the ball of the foot back towards the heel pushes this dirt back, and you get this mound, this ridge across the track, back by the heel. So that's another sign of a real working foot. In the film, if you do stabilization of the creature, you can see it had finger movement, it had wrist movement. It bent at the elbows. You put a man in a suit, because the arms are so long, people say, well, maybe he was using sticks to, I think Hieronymus, as somebody suggested this, Bob Hieronymus, was the last guy to claim to be in a suit. Possibly he used some sort of sticks or apparatus, even though Hieronymus, in his story, which I don't believe a word of, he said he slipped his hands in the gloves. But the problem is he's 5'10" or so. He's under 6 feet. And when we bend, then our arms have to bend at their elbow. Our wrists have to bend here. In order to get as wide as the back was, like Grover Krantz said once, you'd have to hold your arms up to the side of the elbows to get the shoulder width. Then you got this, so then you got to use some apparatus to swing the arms. But these bend, because you can see in the film, in the original film, people saw it, you could see the muscle movement. It's one thing to try to make a fake suit look like it's got muscles, or even make a muscle look like it moves. But these muscles in the film work off of each other. They fire in a certain sequence when we all walk, or we bend our elbows, when we move. Everything works in a certain sequence off the other. To make something mechanical that could do all that and mimic perfectly nature, it's ridiculous. And it wasn't even really available at the time. But then, furthermore, a few years ago, National Geographic, for the first time in history, they did a study where they used science. They used photogrammetry and optic measuring. That's where you can take mathematics, you take the lens size that Patterson used, you can take known measurements that were taken on the film site, You can take a film frame and you can tell distances to everything, the size of everything. This animal in its stooped walking posture from the ground, top of its head, leaning forward, deep knee bends, 7 feet 6 inches high. That put all the 6 foot high guys out of the running as far as I'm concerned. That means standing erect. If it would stand straight up, you could figure at least another 6 inches, put up around 8 feet. They went on to say that only 1 out of 100 million human beings reach the height of 8 feet tall. And those that do have noted abnormalities in their walking gait. This creature walked like it was in its birthday suit. When Roger got behind it and it was walking away up the valley, you could see the space between its legs.
This creature was, had shoulders that were a good 36 inches apart. And the pelvis was as well.
When I wrote my article, Who's Hoaxing Who in the Making of Bigfoot, I showed a guy in an attack dog suit all padded up. He waddled like a penguin because your legs are so bulked, they rub together. You don't have that freedom of motion when you walk. This creature did. 8 feet tall. When you get up over 8 feet tall, you're getting up around the Guinness World Book of Records. And you're talking about people who need apparatuses just to hold themselves and steady as they walk because their muscles are so taxed, their joints, they're usually lock-kneed, the knees are turned in, they have a hard time motoring along. This thing walked away like it was pedaling a bicycle. People look at that film and go, yeah, it walks like a man. But the Russian scientists that looked at it and biomechanics experts in the early 70s when Dehendon took it to Russia, when they watched the film, these are the guys that had the Russian Olympic, they were training Russian Olympians, they realized that this thing walks like somebody who cross-country skis. They said no one walks like that, and they were absolutely right. Here's a track, and I showed you the one up on the mountain in Miles I found. Here's a track that ended up in Ruby Creek. The same year, Archibald happened in late September. A guy by the name of Mark Corton, Mark was in Ruby Creek hunting by himself, and as he got down by the bog area where a lot of the game is, geese and ducks are down that way, a lot of water. It says he got near one of the bogs, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, and he turned, and coming down at an angle, a large stone hit the bog right near where he was at. It splashed him through the wall of shrubbery along there. The water was such a splash that it got him wet. He thought he walked up on a hunter's location. He stepped forward and he looked through, apologized or whatever he had on his mind. He looked through, and all he saw was an upright figure walking away through the bush, but he could only see the outline of something dark. He didn't think it was really tall, like it was only maybe 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall. Mark's 6'4". But he became unnerved, so he got the heck out of there.
First of all, would you state your full name, please?
First name Mark, last name Corton.
Do you wish your identity to be kept confidential?
No. I don't care.
What is your occupation?
I'm a gas fitter.
Do you wear corrective lenses?
No.
How old are you?
30.
Now, first question is, just tell me generally the story. Tell me what happened.
I was walking down this road up Ruby Creek, in this marshy area, moving real slow, keeping an eye on the bush, looking for deer and bear. Caught a glimpse of something black out of the corner of my eye moving. No sound at that point, just something moving. So I quickly spun, mainly just my upper body, towards it. Saw a rock 12 to 15 feet off the ground, kind of arcing down towards me. Landed in the bog. Seemed like right next to me, but I don't know where in that bog it landed, but it seemed like it was right there. Mm-hmm. So I paused and started going through the motions in my head, thinking, where could it have come from? And a bunch of things went through my head, but nothing really made any sense. So I backed up a little bit and I was looking at this grove of trees. I saw something black kind of move, and then it took off like a rocket. My first impression, holy shit. And then I started thinking that I had walked through under somebody's tree stand, and he was whipping a rock at me to get me to take off. At first I thought a person threw a rock at me, but then I saw something take off to the bush, and there was no way that was a man.
How did you react when you first saw it?
I froze.
He wanted to go out there and see what the heck threw this rock at him. The rock was about 18 inches long and about it was as tall as half of the length of the rock. And one of the things he told me during the conversation was that the way it was spiraling. I thought I said, spiraling? You mean like throwing a football? Yeah, spiraling like that. It was rotating fast. So quickly I asked him before he could even think, I said, which way was it spinning? Without hesitation, he says, towards me, forward. I said, that's a good answer. He says, why? What difference does that make? Primates can throw underhand. They can't throw overhand. And when you flip something underhand, you start the rotation going forward. A ball or anything, it's rolling forward. I picked up a rock half the size of what he described. I tried throwing across this narrow logging road. It never got over my head, and I barely got it 7 feet. This thing threw a rock from 40 feet across a bog, and when he turned, he says, just about a foot or two down through those branches, I saw it coming down at a steep angle. So whatever threw it had lobbed it high and threw it towards it, very strong. I said, sure be nice to get that rock. Courtney and his friend never found any tracks. He said, I know the way it went because I could see the bushes move and hear sticks snapping, but I could never see it. It went around the other side, and I know the travel it went around the other side and on out of sight down the side of the hillside. So he goes that way, and they didn't find anything. But when Thomas went in, it wasn't 5 minutes. He says, Bill, bring the camera equipment. So I did. This track here, right here, you can see it through the vegetation where it pressed down. And I don't know if you can see it good enough, but this thing, it actually turned the tips of the toes down when it got into the soft bog, almost as if it's gripping. And that's what it's supposed to do. Remember the foot on Mount Archibald when it was going up the hill? It seemed to be gripping the ground and kept going in the direction of travel. This has 5 toe punctures. They had water standing in them. We waited a day or so to let the water seep out of here because it had been raining the day Mark was there and the day after when I interviewed him. And we let it seep out, and Steenberg actually cast this track, believe it or not. And he has a casting of it at his place. And Mark never knew those tracks was there. And I thought, wow, if this guy wanted to hoax me, he would have made sure that I knew that they found those tracks, come and see them. He never knew. I sent him the pictures. He was so happy that he was able to find evidence to back up his story. Now, if you want to know the classics, I mentioned the Jacko capture up at Yale. That was very interesting. Thomas Steenberg and myself a few years ago were the first researchers in 25 years that actually found that location by the number 4 tunnel. Everything was like it was in the Daily Colonist article. A train was coming from Lytton, and in those days, a gravel road from Agassiz out to Ruby Creek stopped, and it was all forest, all the way up to Hope, all the way up to Yale. There was no road at that time. So this train was coming from Lytton. It rounded the bend. It says, when the number 4 tunnel first came into sight, we saw something laying by the tracks up ahead. We thought it was someone laying there. It blew its whistle. It didn't move. So they had to eventually stop the train. They dismounted, they went towards it, and when they got up to it, it had come to and it scrambled up the rock bluff. It got up so high, about 10 feet or so, because there are 2 rock ledges possible where they said it happened, that it could have gotten to, and they're about 10 feet high. We didn't know which one, they didn't say in the article, but it got hung up. So they called for the bell rope. They didn't know what this strange creature was. It was covered with hair. They never seen anything like it. The term Sasquatch hadn't been coined until the 1920s, I believe, over here at Chehalis by J.W. Burns. So they got the bell rope, they captured it. They telegraphed into town telling them, hey, the train has stopped. You have to tell them why. In those days, a lot of robbery stuff going on. Not to worry, we're a little bit behind. They're bringing this creature in that we captured. So they took it into town. The whole town had heard about this news. It was in a stir. They stopped short of town and dropped it off at the machine shop. They had a doctor named Hannington examine it. In his report, he says that it was 4 feet 7 inches tall, 127 pounds. covered with short black hair all over its body. It had hands and feet, it said paws in parentheses, like a human's, like a man's, but all the fingers ran in the same direction, no opposing thumb like we had. The feet had 5 toes like we have. And it had a short, black, strong hair, it said. And one of the interesting things that the doctor mentioned, from the elbow to the wrist was longer than a man's arm. And they found that it could break a stick by twisting it rather than snapping it like we would have to do. Very strong. What he described was a ape. And I don't think the first gorillas weren't brought over to this continent until around 1902, 1906. So that 25 years earlier, they wouldn't even actually seen gorillas. They would have seen monkeys probably, but not gorillas. Because what you're describing is the size of a chimp or a small gorilla. Those are expensive exotic animals. I said, no one dumps them on logging roads like an old dog you don't want anymore. I said, a Sasquatch is not born big. It comes out as a youngster and it has to grow. They think it got too close to the rock bluff and had fallen and it was just knocked out and knocked the wind out or something. That's how they wound up seeing it by the tracks. They go to take it to England, and somewhere along the line, there's no real trail on it. It ran out. They don't know what exactly happened to it. But in those days, I could only speculate whether you be at sea or on a train. If something dies, you don't leave it laying there, especially if you got a long trip ahead, because they're worried about plague and getting sick from a dead body. No way to preserve it. So they probably pitched it overboard, not knowing what it was. And that was unfortunate, because there was that one opportunity that they could have had the body, and they didn't, and they discarded it.